Just a quick disclosure to share in conjunction with this podcast. Each of us are speaking to our personal experiences and do not consider ourselves experts and cannot offer medical, therapy, financial, or legal advice. We represent a wide range of experience on the autism spectrum and will always honor each perspective that is brought to our discussions. Our experiences, opinions, and perspectives are all unique and different and will be celebrated. Thank you so much for listening and connecting with us. Thank you. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Navigating Adult Autism. We are just a bunch of moms with a lot of perspectives, experience, and opinions. And tonight, we are here with Cynthia, Dawn, Elizabeth, Kara, and Tara. We're missing Heather, and we miss you, Heather. But we also have some special guests tonight that we're very excited about. And our topic tonight is vocational rehabilitation. That was hard for me to say because I usually say voc rehab. That's what us in the disability world call it, VR. Yes, VR, voc rehab. And so I'm going to shoot it over to our guest tonight, and we're going to talk everything tonight about voc rehab. And it'll be a lot of good information for everybody. So I'm going to shoot it over to Kyle. Go ahead, Kyle, introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mary.
You're welcome.
My name is Kyle Reed, and I've been with vocational rehabilitation for a little bit over 8 years. I currently serve in the position of Director of Community Rehabilitation Programs. I was a voc rehab counselor for 7+ years prior to moving into this role about 10 months ago.
Oh, great. Okay. Michelle, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me. My name's Michelle Young. I'm one of the Assistant Directors for Youth Services for Vocational Rehabilitation. I've been with the agency 7.5 years, and I was also a Vocational Rehabilitation Counselor, or VRC, for several years as well.
Okay, so VRC is a voc rehab counselor.
Yep.
So what are your acronyms now? Do you know them?
Oh, that's a good question. And that's something we'll try to be cognizant of tonight as well, is everything in our world is acronyms. So
Right.
we'll try to share what those are for the listeners
Okay.
to eliminate any confusion.
Yeah, we try and do that too because we just start talking about them. We forget that we say them. But,
Right.
Well, if it starts to sound like alphabet soup, just stop us.
Okay. We will. That's a good one. I like that.
Yeah.
So can you tell us about the mission of voc rehab for the listeners that don't know really what you guys are all about? Because I was actually at the doctor today, my dermatologist, and I was telling her about our podcast and who our guests were. And she was like, well, what's voc rehab? And I even said voc, the full term. Can't say it right now for some reason. And so she had no idea. I thought that was interesting because a lot of people don't know.
A lot of people don't. And in fact, that's something that oftentimes we kind of say around VR is we're a secret, a hidden gem, if you will. Mm-hmm. The mission of vocational rehabilitation is to empower individuals with disabilities through employment.
Okay, great.
Does your mission statement go beyond disability? We mentioned reentry, so.
Well, all the individuals we work with, regardless of their status, are all ones with disabilities. So those can be really across the board. So we have some that are physical, we have some that are emotional, some that are cognitive, ones that kind of fall in between. So with this, as long as it creates some kind of barrier to employment, that's really something that we're looking at.
Yes.
Gotcha. And so all of us really, through our experience, have contacted voc rehab usually during the senior year of high school, correct? That's when we technically needed you the most with autistic children, correct? That's the normal process, right? Can you touch on that, on what that process looks like?
So I'm with high school students, so looking at that transition, there's kind of that idea that we don't really start until senior year, but there's so many more services we can provide. So with this, what we try to do is we try to provide services for those who are potentially eligible. So with those, for seniors, we're looking at getting them fully open, fully into a case, and trying to help them with either work, training, or something else to help them along towards their employment journey.
Okay.
But we can technically work with younger students as well. So typically we're working with 16 years and older to provide pre-employment services. So pre-ET services. So with those, we have Mizzou that we contract with. There are MU pre-ETs. That's one of those wonderful acronyms we like to use. But they are able to go in and work on different things with the students, such as self-advocacy and work readiness skills, trying to help them build up different things to help them get ready for employment. And technically, we can also provide services for 14 and 15-year-olds if they have an IEP, 504, or a diagnosed disability, and we have something that shows that they would benefit from services or something that states they would be benefiting from services. And with those, it really depends on them and what they need. So during high school, right now for vocational rehabilitation, we're getting ready to gear up for one of our, my favorite programs of the year. It's our summer work. And what that allows us to do is actually have students who are sophomores and juniors. Sometimes we have ones who are going to be super seniors who will be in longer. So sometimes we can look at that. We want them in the last 2 years while they're coming back to high school after. But what that allows us to do is have them working with other students with disabilities while having someone there who is just kind of guiding them along, teaching them how to work. But it's a safe place to work because for everyone here, how was your first job? Was it easy?
Yeah, right.
It's stressful. You are the only new person most of the time. You're trying to learn. You don't always get the most education with that. They kind of just sit you in front of a screen and have you watch little videos and let you loose. Versus if you're getting your job through vocational rehabilitation, we have up to 7 spots. It just depends on the sites. Some sites want fewer because they want to make sure the students are getting more benefit from those services. So it depends on the employer, but go ahead.
Yes, yeah, my son, youngest, did the summer work program and was at the zoo. And it was amazing. It changed who he was. He grew up. It was like a rite of passage. And it was just, he changed. He went in as a little boy and came out as someone who could be employed. And he loved it. And it wasn't easy. It wasn't easy. He worked at the zoo, and I forgot that he has a phobia of bugs.
Oh.
Yeah. So the first day I thought, oh, man. Mm-hmm. And so I talked to a couple of families. It might have been one of you guys that said, oh, Avon's skin's so soft. So he took his little bottle in his little pack, and, he came home smelling pretty good of manure and skin so soft. But it worked. But that program, it changed not only his life, but it changed our family's life, too, because he became mature and took responsibility, and it was an amazing program.
Yeah, and Michelle touched on something there. Last summer, we opened that up to students going into their last 2 years of high school. Historically, it's been for students entering their last year of high school. And with that, we saw a swell in the number of students who participated in this. But it's an amazing opportunity for students to gain hands-on, real-world skills, transformational skills, and get that first real-world work experience. One question I always like to ask the students at the end of the summer was, what'd you buy? What'd you spend that money on?
Yeah, it's motivator.
Money motivates.
Yeah. And that can kind of go across the board, too, because some of the students immediately spend it. Some of the students actually use it to try to help their family with bills. Yep. So for some of them, they come from families where that could be a real asset. But an additional thing is that I even had one student who he is far more fiscally responsible than most of the adults I know. He started a retirement fund.
I love that.
I mean, doing that with your first job. So with this, you're absolutely right. It can be something where they're getting those skills, but they're learning confidence, because I think one of the biggest barriers to successful employment for a lot of people, especially our youth, is that they've never had it, so they can't envision it. So they haven't experienced, so they don't know if it's a possibility.
Right.
Mm-hmm. And it just gives them that win. And then they can participate again. So let's say we have someone who participates as a sophomore. They could participate again as a junior as long as they haven't gotten successful employment in between. Because we actually have a number of our students who are offered jobs after participating in summer work. So a lot of them get to stay on. And Kyle had touched on how much the numbers grew when we opened up to sophomores. We went from over 800 to over 1,300.
Yeah, and I think there was about 150 that were offered jobs, to Michelle's point.
So it's called the Summer Work Program?
Summer Work Experience.
And who determines who gets the position or who gets to do this? Is it the school? Is it Voc Rehab?
This is kind of a first come, first serve. So whenever the spots are gone, they're gone. But we do have things where we work very hard with our CRPs to try to make sure we can open those up. So for CRPs, our community resource providers. Yeah. Thank you for pointing out my alphabet soup. So for instance, like last year when I was still a counselor and I was doing this, I was working with a school and I had 6 students who wanted to sign up, but there was nothing in their area. So we were able to work with one of our CRPs to have a spot created for them.
Fabulous.
So we were able to get that going.
Yeah, and I just wanted to thank you for sharing that, Elizabeth. That's the best part of our jobs when we get to hear some of those success stories. So I greatly appreciate that.
Was that around how old is that program? That wasn't around when.
2015 was the first summer. So
Okay.
I believe this will be the 10th summer. And those first numbers, that first year in 2015, I think it was around 150 students. And Michelle shared that there was over 1,300 last summer. So this program is it's gargantuan. It's grown significantly in the 9 summers we've had it.
Okay.
So what area, when you give those numbers, what?
How many counties?
This is statewide.
Statewide.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
And the reason we say it's first come, first serve is because, for instance, like if you have a spot at the zoo is amazingly popular.
Yes.
So we have, maybe 7 spots there. Well, whoever gets those spots first is going to be the ones who have that reserved. We might have ones who want to be on a wait list for that, but we want to make sure we're being fair about it. And to qualify, it's actually very simple. All you have to do is be potentially eligible. And to be potentially eligible, it just means that you have to have some kind of diagnosed disability, an IEP, or a 504.
Wow.
And our application for that is amazingly simple. It is 1 page long.
Yep.
And the hardest question that we have on there is your address, because for some reason, a lot of our students do not know their address.
Oh my. Yeah.
And we know they work on that at school, but
We sure hope.
It's hard to remember. But I remember he had, like in the application, he had the list of the potential spots, and then he had to list his top 3.
That's right.
In order of preference.
That's what, as counselors, we tried to do was our providers would put in, they would submit proposals. And these are sites that they've already locked down and solidified that they're willing to work with our students this summer. And then what we would do as counselors is we would present these to the students and have them send them home to the parents, and they could review them. I would have them create a list of like their top 4 or 5 favorites. That way, if their first one's filled up, I would immediately pivot and try to get them a spot at their second one. So,
And then we do have some locations. So, for instance, we have several schools that have signed on to be sites. And if we're able to match that up with summer school, if they provide buses for summer school, sometimes they're able to provide transportation to those students back and forth, because transportation is the biggest barrier.
Oh, yeah.
you guys,
Don't get us started.
you guys are well aware of that.
Oh my gosh.
So
Yeah.
that was a brilliant idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a great program.
Okay, so when you say VR provides these services, I was always under the impression that it wasn't necessarily VR. It was what you said, the CRPs.
So we contract with them. So
Okay.
it's something where they come to us with the sites and locations. We are paying them, and those students become temporary employees of those CRPs. But those counselors are responsible for maintaining contact with those students, reviewing the documents afterwards. But something that I think is the most beneficial for future planning is that at the end of the summer, we end up getting a report that tells us how the student did, what they struggled with, what they excelled in. And then we get to share that information with the students, the families, the schools, and other people who might need to have that to help us with future planning. And the reason we like to do that in the last 2 years is because we want it to be closer to that graduation so we can have useful information for that. Because if we did it sooner, so let's say that we have students who can only do it twice, if we let someone do it who is a sophomore, but they're going to be a super senior and stay till they're 21. Well, if they're participating as a sophomore at 16, that's 5 years. And the information we get at 16 is going to be a very different person from what that will be later on.
Right.
So we want to make sure that we're getting valuable information, because then for parents, you have an idea of what they're doing well, what they're struggling with. It's also very nice because I have parents who they had not had their kids doing chores because they just wouldn't do it. And then whenever they hear all the things that they were doing at the summer work site, suddenly.
Yeah, that's right.
Yes.
The parent's best friend.
Well, and I always, one of the first questions I would ask my students about summer work is, have you done chores? Because if they have any responsibility, it makes it so much easier to start trying to teach them additional skills.
Yes.
So that responsibility is huge.
And that's an excellent question, Don. And it truly is. It's a collaborative effort. Like Michelle said, it starts with our pre-employment transition specialist through the University of Missouri, who's in the schools working with these underclassmen. Then our voc rehab counselors, and then our CRPs. They do a phenomenal job working with and identifying employers to set these opportunities up. So it is a collaborative effort, and I love to be on teams. So this is something that I'm always excited about. This is summer work experience.
It's a great program. That was not around when my son was
Mine
young.
neither.
That's a shame. He would have when you're talking about it, I'm thinking, wow, that really would have helped him for employment.
Yeah.
Well,
So it would help.
It alleviates a lot of struggles, possibly a lot of struggles that we've had. So I'm thrilled about that program.
Well, and Kyle had mentioned the employers. With the employers, they're wonderful community partners because they're inviting us to come in and work there. And we are paying the wages for our students. That's something that we do take care of.
Okay.
But our employers are taking on like the insurance liabilities and things like that. So they're still helping that way. But we've had some amazing sites. So
could you name a few? Can you name them or
what was
not?
the stadium we had this year, Kyle?
In Kansas City, we had Kaufman Stadium. One of the providers worked with the personnel there to get a site set up. Let's see, we've got just locally, historically last year, we had a site at the zoo. There was a site at the Discovery Center. There's sites at, no, it's not Big Golf or Top Golf. It's
Big Shot.
Big Shot, that's the one. And then
And
I see
Backwoods
you've got
Golf
some of
also.
those over there.
Oh,
Yeah, I do.
So we do have some medical centers. And we do have that. The only thing that we try to talk with them about is you are going to have air vaccines and things if you work at those sites. But then we do all like Chateau on the Lake. We have different schools. Once again, that one can be nice because we can do the transportation. We also have some veterinarians who are doing that.
So if you chose to work at the school, what type of activities would they be doing?
That depends entirely on the school because some of them are willing to let them try different things. For instance, I had one school that they had them doing something different constantly. So sometimes they'd be, helping clean the buses. Sometimes they would be doing maintenance. Sometimes they would do doing painting and things within the school. So it really just depended. They tried to get that variety so we were able to get a good idea of what the student did well with, what they struggled with, what they enjoyed. And we just let them kind of expand on that.
That's good. I went to a job fair, the KY3 job fair, which was early in October. And I was sort of surprised to see Springfield Public Schools was exhibiting, Ozark was, So, they're scrambling for food service people and bus drivers. Now, I wouldn't put my child driving a bus, but a work experience in the cafeteria, oh my word, yeah. That's doable.
Well, and this is
Good
great for
experience.
employers because we are having a staffing shortage. And this kind of gives them a way. We had talked about we had more students than we've had who ended up getting offered jobs. That's fantastic because our employers are able to kind of watch them and see how they're doing. And for a lot of our students, that's so beneficial because they may not always present the best in interviews because they're young. They get nervous. They don't know how to do that, but they know how to work. And if they just have that chance to prove that and show that, then they will be able to get those jobs and maintain those.
Yeah.
Right.
Do you get, because Springfield Public Schools has the base program in that, and you're DESE, and DESE runs our public school system?
Should we say what DESE is, though, real quick?
Yeah, sure.
Department
It's
of
Department of
Elementary
Elementary and Secondary Education. I know that one.
Sorry,
So
Dawn, go
excited.
ahead.
No, that's all right. Do you get feedback from the base program? And from my son graduated from Willard, and so he did have some community experiences. I should know the answer to this question, but I don't. Do you get feedback from those experiences so that when my son is presented to VR and to the CRPs, the community rehabilitation providers, they have a much better feel for what he can and cannot do? My son is verbal, but he's not going to communicate well what he wants to do. And because I don't know everything that's available, sometimes I don't know what jobs are out there that are a good fit. Now, I can do some research. Like I said, I went to some job fairs, in October. And so I sort of, I've collected a lot of business cards, along the way. And reading the Springfield Business Journal. Would this company, you read about different companies, would my son be able to work
But
there?
sometimes it's not getting the job, it's keeping the job.
Right.
That's the hard part.
That's the hard part.
We can get the
Because-
jobs. Can't just always keep them.
The soft skills. My son lost a job late last year, right before Christmas. And I would say that he lost interest in doing a quality job for his employer. And there were some soft skill problems. So he was saying things. He doesn't have much of a filter on his mouth. An example, he had a coworker who was a Russian. And because of current events, because of what he's exposed to at home, sorry, Steve, listening to a lot of right-wing media, Russians can't be trusted.
Did he make that statement to that
He did.
coworker? Okay.
Yes. And so, eyebrows are raised, and it is what it is.
But it's also a training issue that ASD.
They have no
autistic-
filters.
They have no filter, and that's just a training issue as well for both parties. I feel we've all talked about that. Don't you think? I mean, it's a
Yeah, and I think
not that it's
going to
okay
be
to say, but yeah, it's just training.
it's going to be easier, I think, to work with JR on doing a quality job than it is to teach him socially or like EQ, emotion.
I don't know.
You know, okay, an IQ, intelligent quotient.
Oh, I
whether there's
thought
any
you said EQ.
emotional.
I'm like,
I did EQ,
Oh, okay.
an emotional quotient.
Oh, gotcha. Sorry.
So that, you know, that piece seems to be missing, and I don't know, you know, how exactly to teach that.
Right.
Because there's a language process deficit, so I know I can't just tell him, you know.
Well, and I
You
think
can't
it's
say that.
finding the employer that gets it, the employer that's going to understand it, and the employer
Work
that's
with you.
going to want to learn about the disability and what is our kids have issues with, and that they may be more accepting if there was a comment like that made. Oh, well, you know, they have no filter. Let's go ahead and mention this to them, you know, and let them know that it's not appropriate, and then let's move on versus just firing them.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, so
Well, it was more than just that. That was
right,
an example.
right.
And yeah, if the coworker, I don't think his coworker who was Russian was offended. I mean,
Right.
Did
I
go
don't-
to HR or anything. Yeah.
that I don't know.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, sometimes those HR things it doesn't even matter if the person wants to file it or not. If it's known, sometimes those things are automatic, which is very sad on that.
Yeah.
But kind of that question about the employers and things like that, we work very hard to try to find the right kind of employers for this, because we don't ever want to set up any of our students or our adults for a bad experience. It's about finding quality and good people. So something that you'd mentioned, Kara, was you talked about, you know, finding the right employer. Well, we can sometimes have a fantastic manager. If that manager leaves, there's no guarantee that next one is
Right.
going to be as accepting.
Yeah.
So one of the things that we try to do for our adults is we do have retention services available. So with that, if it's a good fit, if it's something that they can benefit from, and we have to have, you know, different age requirements. So for instance, I couldn't do it for a 17-year-old who's a junior who's going to be graduating, you know, in 1 or 2 years, because we have to be closer to that graduation before we're offering supports. But for those adults, we actually could potentially send someone in to work with them to help them out and help them learn the job, help them with communicating those needs, helping them with being safe. So for instance, I've had one client, they kind of had a safety word that they used with their supervisor, where if they said that word, the supervisor knew that they were becoming overwhelmed and they needed to go take a break. I've had another gentleman that I worked with who, fantastic, loved working with him, but every few years he just kind of forgot his job over time. So he would come back, reapply, and we would start doing coaching again.
Yeah. And I'd shared with you guys prior to recording that whenever one of my individuals with autism was placed somewhere, and that supervisor, owner, manager, whomever it was a parent or a relative or a loved one of an individual with autism, that's the perfect scenario, because you have a benevolent, understanding individual. But to your point too, Kara, that's also something that we need to do a better job of, and that's educating those employers about some of those behaviors, what to expect. Because if they don't know, then they don't know how to react or to respond.
Is there a training in place for that right now at Voc Rehab for employers, or how do you go about getting employers? And what do you say to them?
Yeah, and that's something that we really lean on our community rehabilitation programs to do,
Okay.
because once our clients have been determined eligible, and if they're going to go into employment, because we have other services that we offer, training, vocational, things of that nature.
Right.
So if they want to go directly into the workforce, they have an informed choice where they will reach out to gather information about the providers and then select the one who they feel is going to best serve them, best represent them. A point you made earlier too, Don, it's important as a counselor that once the individuals have selected a provider, they've made an informed decision, for that counselor to provide that employment specialist at that CRP with all of the important and pertinent information that they're going to need to take into account an appropriate job, an appropriate environment. An example, and I shared with you all, and I failed to do that at the top. My specialized caseload as a counselor was serving individuals in Greene County with autism. And I would typically ask most of my clients when they would come in a series of questions that was specifically related to to the disability of autism. I would want to know if they have sensory issues, how important is routine to them, what about the repetition, environment, large crowds, how do you do in these situations? Because if you have all that information and you can give that to the employment specialist serving them, they can help look and identify the appropriate environment for these individuals. So,
Right.
Were most of the individuals you worked with available to cognitively, metacognition, able to answer your questions?
It always varies, but yes, they were. So
I have a couple things on that because I feel like you ask them the questions, and I, like for my son and other individuals that I know, they'd probably tell you the answers that you want to hear.
Yeah.
You know,
right.
and that's part of their disability. They're not
Right.
really going to tell you, oh, I've censored, maybe now. One time they'll tell you no, the next time they'll say, yes, I hate loud noises.
Right.
But is that part of the learning experience too? Like, do they go back and you could say, yeah, but you told me you didn't, nothing bothered you. So that's, I guess I just thought of it, that that's a learning experience for them too. Like, oh, I should have expressed that differently, but you just have to teach them how to express so many things. As a parent, that's why we're here doing this podcast. It's just
And I always loved it when the parents was present. I would talk directly to my client.
Right.
They're my client.
That's good.
And I used to hear from parents all the time. They would say in the middle of meetings, like, thank you. And I'm like, for what? They're like, talking to him or her.
correct.
When they're my client, that's who I wanted to speak with. But I also love having the parent there because who knows them better than you guys?
Right.
And so you guys can maybe, now remember, so you do have some struggles with this.
Right.
Yeah.
So you're saying that when you ask, I'm sorry, Dawn.
No,
So when they ask, you're asking the ASD child with our adult those questions, do parents often call you on the phone or grab you later or say, hey, by the way,
Most would do it
Right there.
during
right
the
presently? Okay, I didn't know.
Yeah.
Okay.
And I appreciated that too, because then, I could circle back to the
Right.
client and be like,
Get
is
the
that
real story.
right? Is that right? And they're like,
Yeah.
yeah, so
Right,
then they
right.
validate that.
Right. Dawn, were you going to say something else? Or
No, I just flashback job interview. So I was privileged to be in on the job interview, and I probably shouldn't have been. And in retrospect, it was very hard on me because they're asking questions of JR, and it's like,
this before?
yeah, JR would have an inordinate amount of pauses, and he seemed to present as if he couldn't answer the questions. And I'm sitting there, I'm sitting on my hands, I'm biting my tongue. I am not speaking for him. I am not speaking for him. I'm
Right.
not speaking for him. But it was very painful.
That's something that whenever we have our job developers who are working with them, so those are the ones who work with them directly through our CRPs, so those community resource providers to help them with those jobs. As long as it's something the client is comfortable with, they can sometimes even go to those interviews with them to be able to help them. And as long as they have permission, they can even explain to that employer a little bit beforehand about some of those things. It depends. But for instance, if we have someone who wants us to go to an interview, but they don't want to disclose that they're a client of VR, then it just looks like they have an extra adult in there who at that point really
Right.
can't say anything. That's good. And that's whenever it's difficult. But if we can explain to those employers, it gives us a lot more ability to help at that point. Or sometimes we're even able to arrange for working interviews where they can just see them doing the job.
Yeah. And in some instances too, if the individual does not want to disclose, they're working with Voc Rehab, but they're working with the community provider, the employment specialist can meet them at the site of the location of the interview prior to prep them, give them one quick last mock interview and get them ready to go in. So
One quick thing though, as we're talking, we're kind of, I love all the information we're getting, but so we got to have some listeners that might be the first time they've heard anything about this. Can you just give an abbreviated real quick, because I want to get back to the meat of it, but what does it look like if they're saying, oh, I want to do this? I don't even know where to start. I don't know what the process is. So just a quick abbreviated
I was thinking
process.
the same thing. Yeah, like what's the timeline and what exactly happens?
With Voc Rehab?
Yeah,
Signing up
like,
with them?
you
Okay.
know.
Yeah,
Are you
somebody's
talking from
listening.
high school?
You're talking about,
Yeah.
We'll leave it up to you. You can hit it both ways or kind of insert, because, if we're going to have some listeners that are maybe in high school, but maybe an adult, and they're like, oh, I didn't even know there was employment services out there.
yeah. So if you want to talk about the transition from high school, then I'll address adult.
Okay. So for those pre-ET services that we were talking about while they're still in school, and they're getting that kind of timeline until we get up to that senior year, really. Well, final senior year. With those, to receive pre-ED services, it's very simple. It's just a single page application, and then we can start providing those services. And that can be either through our MU pre-ED specialists or through our VRCs who can go out there and work with them on those self-advocacy, on those work readiness, those things.
Where do you find the one-page application?
That gets sent home by that counselor. Or if it's something where you want to receive that and you haven't, well, if they've met with a counselor, I will tell you that there are black voids in every backpack for students. I don't know what it is. Those things disappear.
Those parents need to go through the backpacks every day. Yeah.
But every school does have an assigned VRC. And with that, you can contact maybe your like special education teacher or a WEC if you have one, and let them know that you want to have that. And then they'll be able to make sure that that counselor has that contact information so we can make sure that gets to you. Because sometimes it's just a matter of just knowing someone is okay with it and me emailing it with permission, because the school can't always give me those emails if the backpack keeps eating the paperwork.
Right. So ours came from our special ed teacher, probably like most of us. Probably
Ours came from an open house. We went to an open house and there was a table for VR. That's where I got the paper.
Well, and I do just want to add real quick.
And it wasn't on the IEP? Nobody came in on the IEP?
Mine was the IEP when we first heard.
We have to be invited to the IEP because the parents have to give us permission to be there. So if we don't have that permission, we can't. We do make sure that schools have information about VR, but we can't really control what's being said or presented at that time. And sometimes they're focusing on kind of what's right in front of them. Our teachers have so much to do. I mean, there's a lot that's expected of them. And sometimes our parents aren't confirming an IEP until 2 or 3 days beforehand. And most of our counselors are booked up 1 to 2 weeks in advance. So that can be difficult as well. But thankfully, virtual options have made that a lot easier. So we are able to at least join in virtually as long as that's an option and someone has availability. So that's something we're able to do. And through those pre-ED services during those years, we're able to do things such as the summer work program. We have Missouri Youth Leadership Forum, which is something where students actually get to go up and stay at Mizzou for a week, and they get to learn all kinds of different things. So they get to talk to employer panels, they get to talk to college panels. They actually get to go to the state capitol and learn about different kinds of like disability laws and things like that. And they also get to create their own laws. They get to create some very interesting ones sometimes.
And that's called what? The
Missouri Youth Leadership Forum.
They stay in the dorms too, so they kind of get a little college campus feel too. So.
That's cool.
And they do provide good supports there. So if someone has needs and things like that, they do try to make sure that they receive those. They are not just working that entire time. They also get to have fun. They have dances where you get to see some very interesting dance moves. They have a talent show. So they get to enjoy it. But I think the main thing is also, like Kyle said, they get to stay on the campus. They're getting that college life. And for a lot of them, they may not have ever thought that they could be successful at college because maybe they are wheelchair bound and they're not sure what that'll look like. Well, what if they can see that they can do well with it? It works. And that's something that, I believe it's the Missouri Governor's Council on Disability that does that, if I remember correctly. We have all kinds of acronyms on that. We also have Camp Wonderland. That's something available not here in this area, but in another part of the state where we have a camp that will let our students work there over the summer. And they have all kinds of different jobs they can do. Sometimes they can work with like the food service. Sometimes they can actually work in recreation. They're able to actually help the campers there. And that's something where all the campers are ones who have different kinds of disabilities. So they get to help other students who have disabilities.
Right. Cynthia, then was that where your son went?
He went to Camp Encourage
Okay.
in Kansas City, Kansas, yeah.
Well, camps are wonderful.
They're wonderful.
And that's a unique one because it's vocational rehabilitation, partnering with Camp Wonderland, as well as the job centers in those areas. Because what happens is the job centers that pay the students and VR is paying the camp or students' weeks and stuff.
Right. Okay.
They're already graduated.
Nope, there are ones who are still in high school.
Wow.
We have several other programs as well. We try to make sure that we have these available. It's just if people apply for them or not, and if it's available in your area. For some of these, it's something where we just want students to know about it. But like Kyle said, unfortunately, sometimes we're a well-kept secret, not because we want to be. We do go to the fairs. We try to go to as many schools as we can, but unfortunately, sometimes they may not have the students there because maybe they're going on different trips or they're doing different things or they're in core classes that they can't be taken out of. So that can be a barrier to that.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add real quick too, if there's any listeners out there and you have a loved one that is an underclassman still in high school, and you want to put post-employment or post-secondary on their radar, and you don't know if they're working with the Mizzou pre-employment transition specialist or with a voc rehab counselor, reach out to the school, reach out to the counselor, special ed teacher there that you might know, special education director, and just let them know that you'd like that loved one to participate in those services. So
That's good advice. And also, if they have a service coordinator, can it come from the service coordinator as well or no?
They may or may not know. Just depends on the area and how involved they are with the schools.
Okay.
Because I know that there's some schools that are great at letting in DMH services, and there's some schools where that may not be something that's commonly done.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. No, that's good information.
And then in their senior year, that's whenever, or final year, because we have some students who graduate on milestones and things like that. So with that, whenever they're getting ready to graduate, that's whenever VR comes in that kind of last year, and we start talking with them about what do you want to do, what do you want to be, and helping them do that research to see if it's going to be a good fit for them. And then we want to have them into a plan before they graduate, if possible. It's not always possible, but we try to do that to help it so that whenever they're leaving high school, we're already working on something to help them next.
Absolutely.
So whether that be training, whether that be helping them with identifying an apprenticeship, whether that be help with employment, it just depends on that individual, because we have so many different kinds of services, because we don't want to just have one thing and kind of box people into it. And it can be frustrating for people sometimes because there are options.
Right.
One of the things that I have gotten from clients repeatedly through the years is, well, what jobs do you have available? Well, we're not going to answer that, because that's not something we do. We are not just a job board and you get to pick something off. Because what's a good fit for you may not be a good fit for someone else.
Right.
So for instance, I know that with our agency, we've had people become everything from janitors to doctors.
Wow.
Yeah, and every service is individualized. So I think that that's kind of where Michelle was going there, is it's going to be different for every individual. So
what about providers? Should we talk about providers?
Yeah.
So
they get to choose a provider, right? You
That's right.
you advise them.
That's right. So like Michelle said, so what we do, once the referral's been made to voc rehab, a referral gets scheduled to meet with a voc rehab counselor for their intake. So at that meeting, we just gather information, go through some documentation, start to establish some of that rapport and build that relationship. And then what we'll do is we usually try to encourage folks when they come in for that intake, if you have any documentation that supports that this is an individual with a diagnosed disability, to bring that. And the purpose is it expedites getting those individuals eligible for our services, because typically where we would experience the delay in services is after that intake, we'd have to request records. And we are at the mercy of whatever provider we've requested those records from to get those to us in a timely manner. So if you have those, it expedites getting folks eligible if you can bring those at that intake meeting.
And you might also talk about the Social Security Award letter.
Yeah, and it's always good to bring that as well, because if you're an individual who has receives SSI or SSDI, if you're eligible for that benefit, then you would be presumptively eligible for voc rehab services. So you could bring that in at your intake. A voc rehab counselor could use that to establish presumptive eligibility while we wait on further documentation. That way we can get those folks started, get them started with vocational planning, identifying some areas of interest, talking to them about their work history, their volunteer history, things that they're interested in, maybe identifying skills and strengths and barriers and impediments. So, yeah, Don.
Does an IEP qualify?
An IEP does.
Okay.
Yep. It's a good question.
We just have to make sure that there's actually a diagnosis there and what the IEP is for, because sometimes we do get IEPs that it's not really clear what the diagnosis is. The school was trying to get them services.
Other health impaired or
Yes.
something.
Okay.
might be
So we do have to have, sometimes we do have to have additional information. So for instance, if I get one that says emotional disturbance, I'm going to have to request additional information, because emotional disturbance is not necessarily a diagnosis that we would use.
So since this is an autism podcast, if it says
Autism would be.
autism,
Yes.
we get the gold ticket.
Yeah, and I mean, and there have been changes with the DSM criteria and everything. They've gone away from pervasive developmental, they've gone away from Asperger's, and now they put it all on a spectrum. And we can use old records that indicate some of those prior to that DSM-5 changing that. So,
Okay, changing the gear. On our first podcast, I told about an interaction that I had with Temple Grandin and how I mentioned my child's diagnosis is PDD-NOS, and that's going away, so he's going to be cured, right? And she just looked at me and goes, no, he'll get another diagnosis. And it's like, okay, here's this brilliant person with autism. But what I don't share as readily is because she went on to ask some questions about my son. Is he verbal? And I was able to say yes. Can he go to Walmart and make his own purchase? I could say yes. She then asked me, what does he like to do with his free time? And I knew I was in trouble because I'd heard her speak. And I knew if I said video games, I knew I was going to get a mini, very polite, but a mini lecture. Mm-hmm. And, you think back on that, and Mary was a good role model for me.
Thank you, Dawn.
No, yeah. And I did it this morning, and I was talking to Cynthia about things that I can add to my list because my son's currently unemployed. And it's like, he should not be in front of the video game player all day long. And Temple Grandin has said too, I was out with the cattle, and that built on my interests, and, that became her profession. And so, if people are listening to this with young kids, get them out as much as possible. Volunteer at different places. Mm-hmm. That way you can be the support person. Absolutely. You can be the job coach. And it's not always fun making them do those chores. Mm-hmm. My mom always said it was easier for her to just do it than to listen to me whine about, what the chore was. And I don't have a diagnosis, at least not yet.
I got to say, if I could just complain enough my husband do the chores, I would probably be all over that. But something you had mentioned was video games. Those can be hard because sometimes they can be helpful. So
fine motor. Mm-hmm.
Fine motor, but also if they're doing any cooperative games, so games where they're playing with other people, they learn about communication, they learn problem solving, they learn teamwork, but it's moderation.
Yeah,
that is the hard part.
See, I'd be taking that video game to work with me. Mm-hmm. Guess what, Kelsey? It needs to be fixed. I've got to take it to the shop. Well, and that would take the video game out of the home.
Yeah, too much screen time.
And a list for things for him to do.
Absolutely.
And depending on the kind of games they play, if they play ones that are on their phones or things like that, there are actually apps you can add to their phone so it will limit their time or turn off during certain times.
Mm-hmm. We have that.
So,
we have a circle modem that they get, and I can press a reward button so that the kids can get more time. But also there's apps, like there is some video game playing. I know Dawn's rolling her eyes at me, but one of the things that helped Zion was the Social Express game, which was helping him with his social skills. So there are some good video games.
I've never seen the socials.
Oh my gosh, it was great and Zion loved it. It was really interesting because at that time we had no money.
Called what?
Well, I don't even know if it's still out there, ladies. But at that time, I remember it was $100, and that was so expensive for us because we were paying for ABA therapy out of pocket and all that. And somehow I was listening to a podcast or like some sort of program, and I called in and I won it for free. So it was like, I don't know what happened in the stars that allowed it, but all my kids love that little app. So I'm sure it's probably exploded now. And it may be way more than what it was back then, but it was essentially like a cartoon social story, but my kids loved it. So.
Mary, I think we left off.
Sorry.
Was once we have established an individual to be eligible for voc rehab services, we begin vocational planning.
Right.
And that can go a variety of directions. You asked specifically about the providers. Well, before we get there, I think Michelle touched on a little bit earlier. There are other services that we do offer. If an individual, because we are encouraging our counselors to be more a career pathways approach when doing vocational planning. And so we're looking into a lot of training now, looking into a lot of vocations, certifications, degrees. So there's a lot that goes into that. We have to do our labor market research, and we have to indicate if, first and foremost, this area of interest that our client has expressed requires training, requires a degree, requires a certification. And then if it does, we do labor market research because we want to make sure that if you're going to put all this time, effort, energy, stress, anxiety, money into pursuing these things, it's going to lead to employment ultimately. So we want to do our labor market research to see what those occupational areas of interest look like. Are there going to be opportunities? What's the 10-year projection look like? Is it a shrinking industry? Is it a growing industry? And if it is, then we start working towards that direction. If folks want to go directly into the workforce, we did touch on this briefly earlier, then they have informed choice. There historically have been 5 community rehabilitation providers here in Springfield. We do just have a 6th, and that's called Imagine Technical Institute, and they're actually down in Hollister, but they're going to be serving Taney, Christian, and Greene counties. And in addition to that, the other 5 is Abilities First Employment Services, which is affiliated with the Next Step and the service coordination and support coordination services that they offer there. Preferred Employment Services, which is in the middle of a name change, and they're going to be Supported Living and Employment Services moving forward. ARC of the Ozarks and their Employment Solutions Department. Developmental Center of the Ozarks.
MERS Goodwill.
And MERS Goodwill.
Which one of those have autism-specific programs?
Okay, so we've got different program services models that we offer. The 2 most popular are, again, here comes some acronyms, ES, which stands for Employment Services, and SE, which stands for Supported Employment. And what you're asking about, Kara, is it's called Employment Services Plus. And there are 3 specific disabilities that some of our providers have obtained additional accreditation to provide services to these individuals. And those 3 areas are individuals with autism, brain injury or neurocognitive impairments, as well as the deaf of hard of hearing. So currently in Springfield, since this is an autism pod, we have Preferred Employment Services / Supported Living Employment Services, Developmental Center of the Ozarks, and MERS Goodwill.
Okay.
Okay, well, does ITI also have that?
They do not have ESP for individuals with autism.
Okay.
They have employment services and supported employment, and they will be offering employment skills training as well.
So the accreditation that you were talking about for autism, what does that entail? What additional accreditation do they need? What additional education for them to be eligible for that autism specific?
So all of our providers have to obtain accreditation. Most of our CRPs around the state, there's about 60 statewide and approximately 125 or 30 service locations statewide. And so they have to obtain accreditation. Most are using CARF, which is the Commission of Accreditation or on Accreditation of Rehabilitation Facilities. There's a couple around the state, I think in the St. Louis area, that were grandfathered in under a different accreditation. But for autism specific, those ESP autism programs, they do have to go through additional CARF accreditation process for those specialized services. So they have to do additional training. And then once they've received their CARF accreditation to offer that, the employment specialist who's going to be considered an autism specialist or working in the ASD department at that provider, they have to do additional training specifically relating to autism in addition to their required training. So,
okay, great. Good to know.
And those are excellent questions. But there is actually an internal review at Voc Rehab where our quality assurance team has been looking into that ESP, and they're focusing on that P part because we want to ensure that that plus is being offered to individuals who's being provided that service around the state.
Okay.
So,
can you talk about the cases when they're open and closed and what that entails? You know, like when someone finds employment, then your case is closed right after 90 days if the individual has employment. And then is it reopened again when they're let go, they quit, or what is that?
How many times can you reopen?
Right.
Okay, so first off, 90. 90, we close them at 90 if they're independently employed and only if it's a good fit. They're doing well, there's not any problems.
Right.
Because we're not going to close the case at 90 days if there's known issues. That's not right, and we want to do right by our folks.
Okay.
And Kara, to your question, we had a little more stern restrictions, I guess, on how many cases within a certain time frame you could open, but now you can open another case. So, if, for example, a client's case gets closed as successful, and then 3 weeks later they start having some issues on the job, if we're too late and we can't get the provider who was serving them back in to offer some more on-site support, they can't come back and reopen another case with voc rehab. So
is that a lengthy process, or is that just work on a little paperwork?
go ahead.
I was going to say, actually, with those follow-up ones, it's usually a lot faster because if they already
You have all the paperwork
Everything's
already.
there. That's
so we
right.
don't have to wait for the medical documentation. We will have to have you fill out the packet again, just the information about you and things like that,
New
because
client.
sometimes those things can change. But something that we do have is sometimes people get frustrated waiting for an appointment. You can also see if that office does walk-ins, because if they do, they can be seen much sooner.
Oh,
nice
Yeah,
to
there's
know.
a
I
like
didn't
at
even know
the,
walk-ins was an option.
yeah, like at the Springfield South office, for example, the counselors have designated walk-in times where if a client just comes in or a referral just walks in, they fill out that documentation that Michelle referenced, and then whoever the designated walk-in counselor is during that period of time will see them. So now it is expedited if they do come back because they do have all the paperwork. It's still there in the office, still readily available. But counselors are very busy. So it's getting them back on the counselor's calendar and then back to that choice of provider. And so it does take a little time, but it is much more expedited than a brand new case.
So question, if you say you were going through preferred and you didn't like the counselor or you didn't like that company, they weren't quite working well with your child, can you switch to another one?
To another provider.
Yeah.
It's always going to be what the client wants.
Okay.
Now, there is some things too, though, like we always try to talk through to make sure all the information is provided. And what I mean by that is if you've been working with a specific provider for a while, they've gotten to know the individual. The individual's gotten to know them. They've already been doing some work together, working on mock interviews, working on professional resume development. So if you're going to pivot and switch and go to a different provider, it delays things.
Okay.
Because
Good
now we've got to get you rescheduled with another provider once you've done informed choice all over again. And then we got to get that meeting scheduled and then provide them all the information and then them get to know that individual. And that may just take a little time. But again, it's in the best interest of the client. If that's what their desire is, then we'll
So
offer
it'd just
that.
be easier, really, if they weren't working well with a certain counselor with this provider, then they have other counselors. So just switch to another counselor and stay with the same company.
Well said. That's probably
idea.
the best first step to do.
Okay.
So, because I mean that happens. Sometimes there's just just people just don't mesh. So, and I think you guys have talked about that on previous podcasts. Sometimes it's just not a natural fit, and it's okay to ask for a change. And I know providers I've worked with as a counselor before, if we've had difficulty getting a client placed, after a while, like a program manager would have approached me as a counselor and been like, thinking about changing up employment specialists to serve so-and-so. Maybe new set of eyes, new set of ears, new ideas. And me serving individuals with autism change isn't always easy. So I would want to talk to them first, make sure they're okay with it, talk to the parents' support system and ensure they're okay with it as well. Because the last thing I want to do is further create more anxiety. And changes can do that. New people can do that.
Right.
So
Do you keep track of, I'm sorry, Cynthia.
No, I didn't. No.
No, go ahead.
Oh.
Who was speaking? I'm sorry.
That was me.
Oh, sorry, Michelle.
Sorry, I was just going to say,
My bad.
it's not just the CRPs that you can sometimes make those changes with. Sometimes even on the vocational rehabilitation counselor side, there may not be the best fit. So people can sometimes ask to make those changes, but there might be some things that go with it. So for instance, like at one time I served Christian County, then I served Lawrence County. So like I would be the counselor who was traveling to those whenever I served those counties at that time. So someone could have switched to another counselor, but they might have to go up to Springfield to see that counselor, or they might have to do virtual instead. It just kind of depends. But we do try to make sure that people have that ability. But it kind of depends, because sometimes we'll have people call up and just be like, well, I just don't want to work with females. Okay, well, let's talk about that a little bit.
Right.
Oh, there's a lot to talk about, isn't there?
in some instances there are.
It's just, you just never know.
Is Stepping Stone still a provider out there, or are they gone?
Well, they, to my knowledge, weren't an employment provider, a community rehabilitation provider, but I do know that they had some, I used to take some referrals from Stepping Stones. They would do a lot of day program stuff and be involved in the community doing some volunteering and things like that. So,
And as far as providers, who do they report to? Do they report to you guys? Like, who holds them accountable?
Well,
Voc
right.
Rehab
And
does,
also
right?
success rates. I mean,
Do you keep track of those?
how does that work? How do you monitor them to make sure that they are doing what they're supposed to be doing?
Well, with us, as far as keeping track, they do give us regular updates and reports. So we're able to see what's happening. We're able to observe that anything that we're doing as far as they are going to get paid based on the work they're doing. So for instance, if they get someone a job, they're going to get paid. If that person makes it to 30 days, they get paid. If it makes it to 90 days, they're getting paid.
Okay.
So they have incentives to do the job well, because what's happening is if they're not matching them well and that person's quitting, they're not going to
get paid.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, and we
What's the
offer
point?
Milestones. Our authorizations and the work we do with providers are done through milestones. So like Michelle said, there's a placement milestone, a retention milestone. But they do, if the individual isn't placed, they are required to provide monthly progress reports. CRPs are to that voc rehab counselor that they're sharing and serving that individual with.
Good to know.
Okay, I didn't know that.
What happens when you make the assessment that you cannot provide or you cannot well, let me backtrack. Is there ever a case where you say, we can't support this individual? I'm sorry, we can't serve.
And I'll go ahead and add to it. With the moms that couldn't be here, Heather, her son has profound autism, and I spoke with her earlier today, and she, the voc rehab came in when he was 16 years old and worked with him for a couple years and had the meetings. And finally it was determined, I think it was the senior year in high school, that he wasn't employable. And it was very heartbreaking for her, for one. And I asked her, I was like, okay, so did they even give you a packet? Did they give you a packet of resources, say, okay, voc rehab, because he is profound, he needed help with certain areas and he needed a one-on-one.
Right.
And so I was like, so when they determined that, did they give you a packet of other resources,
Right.
That could kind of help guide you to the next step of life, since VR couldn't?
Yeah, and there are some things out there. So I can't speak for every voc rehab counselor, but I know when I was a voc rehab counselor, and again, I served individuals with autism. That was my specialized caseload. And I've heard on previous podcasts, you guys have touched on some waiver services that are available.
Yeah.
So, Don, if an individual wasn't ready for competitive integrated employment, there are things out there, waiver services that we could utilize. Now, what I would do as a voc rehab counselor is, if I recognize this might be an option early on into that individual's case, I'd collaborate with that support coordinator early on about, hey, just in the event we're not going to recommend them to move forward with seeking out competitive integrative employment at this time, could we utilize a waiver services for pre-vocational skills training? And so it takes time to get those plans changed, approved, reviewed, and all that. So I would try to get that started early on. That way, whenever we got to that point, if we were going to make that recommendation for pre-vocational skills training, there wasn't a lag. Because we want to strike while the iron's hot. We don't want there to be much lag. So if an individual is going to do pre-voc, we'd work with them, the support coordinator, and then there's a variety of locations in the area where they'll go out and they'll work in a variety of locations that they choose, specifically on the areas that they need to further enhance and skills that they need to develop. Mm-hmm. So once they've completed their assessment, their trial work plan, we've identified areas where they need to improve. If it's safety, if it's, you name it, that's what we would try to work on in pre-voc is building up this area, and this area.
Do you refer individuals to the sheltered workshop?
We do not make any referrals to the workshop, but what we can do is if someone wants to go to the workshop and they are under 25, we can actually get them evaluated by a C, which is a competitive employer evaluator. So they can actually see if they are ones who would be able to go to the workshop. And that's something that it is someone's choice, but that's not something that we're like, oh, you have to do this. We don't do that because we want people to have options. Yeah. It's like what Kyle was talking about, those pre-employment services, the waiver supports. Sometimes we have people who we go through and we find that, we've done the trial work. They could work, but they need additional supports. So sometimes VR can provide coaching for a certain amount of time, and then we can get DMH waivers to continue offering some supports afterwards. It depends on the individual. But I know, for instance, like CC Links, whenever I worked with them here in Christian County, there would be times where we would do a trial work plan and the person would just need extra things, or maybe they had a job and we were doing coaching and they needed extra coaching to keep going. Then we could try to use those kind of documentations to help them get what they needed for that. It depends on the individual, but we do have some people who just want to work at the workshop because that's where their friends are. That's where they know people at.
Right.
Sometimes it's transportation because typically workshops do provide transportation. it just depends on those individuals.
Yeah.
Well,
and
and
again, she
sometimes-
mentioned that competitive, evaluator, that C earlier. It's legislation that if they're 24 and under, that they have to come through VR for that certification. So,
Right.
But they don't have to go through a full VR case. We can, if they just want to do a direct referral, we can get them set up with that C to get that going.
Right.
Or if they're not sure, those trial work plans or those discovery and explorations where they get to test out different jobs, see what they do well with, see what they don't do well with, and get an idea of if they do want to try working like that. It just gives them a taste of that so they can figure out what might be good next steps.
Can you do a self-referral? Because we're using the word referral. Can somebody just self-refer?
To VR or the workshops.
Well, I guess
For the workshop. So if you have someone who calls up and they only want workshop, they do not have to go through VR, but they would have to call us so we could give them their information to a C so they could do that.
And that's for under 25.
right. If they're 25 or older, they can do a direct.
Yeah, then they can go directly to the
reach out
workshop.
to SWI or whomever that workshop might be in that area.
But that legislation was put in place to try to protect our youth. That way they weren't just being streamlined to that workshop to give them options, because otherwise some of them may not ever have had that exposure.
Yeah, and that was called WIOA. That was the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, which I think was 2014 whenever that was passed. So.
Okay.
Yeah.
I know we're running out of time, but if I can squeeze in one more question, get your responses on the mic. I've asked this question where my son is on the spectrum. I just flat out put on the resume. I just think. So, what's your opinion about, do you disclose on the resume? Is that a help or a hindrance?
Well, for me, I would say it's completely up to the individual. Again, every case is individualized. So if a person wants to disclose that, by all means, then you can include that on there. I don't think I would, just simply because discrimination does exist, fair, unfair, right or wrong. And that may be something that somebody may look at and just immediately just ignore that. So,
but if they immediately dismiss because they see the word autism, it's like, I'm not sure I want my son there.
There's a couple ways to look at that, because if it's not an employer who's willing to consider them, it may not be the right employer. But sometimes the person who's looking at the resume may not be the person doing that interviews.
Right.
Oftentimes that interview is kind of a good place if they feel comfortable with it.
Right.
But what we do try to explain to our clients is that if you want supports, if you want accommodations, disclosure would be part of that. It's just finding that right time to do it.
Yeah.
And the right time is not whenever you've already gotten in trouble at work and you're at risk of being fired.
Right.
Yes.
And Don,
I'm not
right.
And Don, you shared your experience earlier about sitting in on an actual job interview with your son and how comfortable that was for you. And that's something, too, our employment specialists do. If our individuals want that specialist in there with them, they'll sit in there with them. And then that way they can help explain some things. So our providers do great work. And that's one of the examples of what they can do to keep parents like you from having that uncomfortable experience. So.
I think I need to experience that uncomfortableness to motivate me to do better.
Well, can I talk about if we have any employers that are listening, what benefits do they have? Are there like tax credits? What is available to them to better employer kids?
I have this really excited look on my face. Yes, there are tax credits for that. If they're hiring someone who has Social Security, they get tax credits for that. I know that this was before the podcast. We were talking about individuals who are justice involved. Oftentimes they can get tax credits for that. But the additional thing they get is they get supports, because if they hire someone off the street, if that person doesn't come into work, they have no one to contact. Versus if our clients don't show up, they have a vocational rehabilitation counselor, they have a job developer, they potentially have a job coach, they might have support coordinators. There's an entire team of people to support that client.
Right.
So with that worker, they have someone to help, and they have an entire team helping them to have the growth of an employee.
Success.
And there's a lot of examples too where employers, they enjoy hiring individuals with disabilities because they are reliable. They're there.
Yeah.
So
they're real followers usually. Yeah, for
they're
sure.
sometimes the most loyal because they do not always have that experience in their life. So whenever they do show up and they are doing that, they just stay. So something I had talked about was I have a cousin with Down syndrome, and she was not going to be hired. Whenever she was graduating, actually made the mistake of saying that's what it was. So thank you to that employer for buying her first house with that lawsuit. But she's been at the same job she's been at since she was in high school. And whenever she works, she is in the zone. She does a lot of bagging of groceries and stuff. And it doesn't matter who it is that goes through line, including me, who is her self-declared favorite cousin. She doesn't get to say, I'm her favorite. But she will not talk to any of us because she is working.
Right. Right.
So tax credit, what kind, what would they get for like a part-time or a full-time? Does it vary on the job? What is it? For, again, the employers that they're looking into it.
That's something that our business specialists would probably be able to speak to more.
Okay.
Because they're the ones who do a lot of that outreach and speaking and honestly trying to recruit some of our employers for us.
Okay.
But that is something that they can receive for those.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
And those business services is an incredible program too. So I think it was a good plug there, Michelle. So, but the providers do that as well. Whenever they've helped an individual apply for a position and they're communicating back and forth with that potential employer. If the individual, again, Don, I'm going to leave that up to them, whether they want to self-disclose. If that individual self-disclosed, then the provider can work with that employer and let them know about some of these tax incentives and breaks that they would get. Okay. So
now, what about college? Are individuals that, college is an option for them and they want to go? Does Voc Rehab help with college tuition?
Absolutely. If, again, going back to if the employment goal or the career goal or the career pathway requires training, requires a degree, and then there's also a financial component with that as well. We have to
You're
take
limited.
into account.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And we also have to make sure that any jobs we're going for are appropriate for them and their support needs. So, for instance, we never want to put someone in a job or a career path that's going to exacerbate or make their disability worse. Because we want them, we want long-term success.
And if there are any listeners out there who do have loved ones that are in college, if you're unaware of it, most colleges have a disability support office. And again, that's self-disclosure. In high school, it's law. You have to provide accommodations to individuals with disabilities. In college, it's based on disclosure. So if you will work with that department, they can discuss accommodations with professors or instructors. Maybe if you need additional test-taking time, then they can discuss that and maybe get that worked out. You need somebody to take notes while you actively listen because you struggle to do both at the same time, then that might be an accommodation or an example of one that could be provided. So keep that in mind for anyone out there who does have a loved one with a disability enrolled in college.
Yeah, that's a good point.
And
Go ahead.
with VR, whenever we're talking about training, we're not talking about just absolute bare bones. We try to help people reach what it is that they need to be successful. So, for instance, one person, it might just be a certificate. Someone else, it might be a doctorate. It depends on that individual and what's appropriate for them.
Wow, that's great.
A quick clarifying question. So VR, you do not need a support coordinator, correct?
Right.
Correct.
If you're going to go on and waiver and all this stuff, then and have further, you would have to, have a support coordinator to.
A lot of folks don't qualify for a support coordinator, so we still serve those individuals as long as they meet the eligibility criteria.
Oh, that's great.
It's just that then they won't have those waiver supports for those other things. So because VR can focus on employment and services to help you work towards employment, but sometimes people have other needs that those waivers could really help with if they can receive them.
So somebody might not qualify, and that's okay. And they might qualify, but they don't need to wait to start with VR.
Absolutely.
Right now, those support coordinators, a lot of their job is to put those individuals that they are serving in touch with resources in the community. And we were one of those resources. So we work closely with support coordinators. They're one of our larger referrals in the Springfield area because they're directly serving individuals with disabilities and getting them in touch with resources like Voc Rehab for employment. So they do good work and valuable work.
And before wrapping it up, about employment, do you have someone at Voc Rehab that actively searches for sites for new employers that might employ somebody is there someone out there just for that job to, hey, let's go find, I don't know, I'm trying to think, any business in Springfield.
Like a specific person may want to go into computers. Right. And then that is going to be the best job for them. Do you guys go out and search for
New employers.
Yes. Well, one example, Michelle mentioned earlier the business services team that Voc Rehab has. We have a
Is that who does that?
We have a business specialist in each region of the state. So locally, what we might do, one example of the question might be if we're helping an individual to get, say, an associate's degree in graphic design, well, then that business specialist, they may reach out to businesses and start establishing a relationship and seeing if they have any need.
Talk about the tax credits.
That's right. And advocating like, hey, we've got an individual who's about to earn their associate's degree in graphic design. They would be a perfect fit. Here's some of their experiences. So that might be one resource that we can offer.
Okay. So it wouldn't be uncommon for a parent to say, hey, can you look down this avenue?
Right.
Even if you don't have them under your radar or on your list.
And typically that would be the job of an employment specialist at one of the providers. Unless we're assisting the individual with some sort of vocational training, then we would utilize a business specialist for that particular scenario.
Okay. But it can sometimes work a little bit the other direction because those business specialists will often form those relationships with employers who will let them know what it is that they need and what kind of talents they might need from those clients. So sometimes they can send those job leads out to those counselors and you might be able to see, oh, this kind of fits with what this client is wanting.
Right.
So they really help bridge those relationships with those employers, help them understand what we do, what supports we have, but also help them advocate for our clients before our clients ever appear before them.
Right. Okay. That's great information. I think Cynthia and I have run into a person that owns a business here in Springfield and didn't know she was hiring a person on the spectrum. And it caused a little problem at times, but we were kind of exploring that with her to hire, and she, didn't really want to at this time because it was just so much work. And I think that I'm not saying that to insult her or anything. I just think it's a good education because she's mentally tired. She's a small business. I don't know, a handful of employees, maybe 10. I don't know, maybe less than that.
Probably less.
But yeah, and it was been really taxing on her to run her business and for her other employees. And I just think that is another training issue that needs to be out there. She's a wonderful person, wonderful company. But I understand it. I understand it from her. It's sad, but kind of hurts our feelings a little bit as mothers, but I kind of get it too. Like she spent.
Because we get tired. We get tired.
Yeah. And it's an everyday thing that we live.
Yeah.
So I'm just throwing that out there for employers because I think we can't forget that that's, this inclusion word is always pushed so hard and I'm just on the fence about it because it drives me nuts sometimes because inclusivity is hard. And it's right there. This was just happened this week. And even around Christmas. Yeah. That, all the people just pushing inclusivity, it's hard. It's not easy. It's not an easy path. Even my son who reported a 7-year-old to security because she touched something, that she wasn't supposed to and called security on her. I mean, these are all trying issues for typical employees to put up with day in and day out. Not saying they shouldn't, but it's wearing. And right now, this friend of ours that owns a business, she needs a break. She can't. You know what I'm trying to say? It's sad, but it's true. But there's a training issue, and there's just so many things that need to be resolved. So.
Well, and there could be those supports. Maybe she would be willing to hire someone if she knew that they were going to have coaching and what that coaching would look like.
Right, and she could get a tax
Exactly.
credit.
Yeah.
We'll work on it, Michelle.
Send her my way.
We'll send her your way. Yeah.
Well, I'd like to ask you guys. We're all parents here. We're all moms. What advice can you give us? Right. If when we're starting, whether it's in high school or whether we're starting again, our kid just got, fired. Well, and that happened here just 2 months ago. 4 of our kids got fired or quit, and then we're starting over again. What can you recommend to parents that can help us in this new stage of life?
Like, I feel like I should just call you guys.
Exactly. Can I have your cell phone number? No.
Well, I think that what you guys are doing here is incredible. And I think what you've done is one example of that can answer that question, Kara. Nobody gets it like you all. No one understands. But you guys do. And in each other, you have support. And you have people who does understand when one of your kids loses their job, whether it be quitting or getting fired. So I think you've done some of that just naturally by finding each other.
Mm-hmm.
So,
Okay.
I think a lot of it, and this
Thank you.
is so cheesy coming from someone who works in the social services area, self-care. Give yourself some grace, because sometimes you feel all this pressure to be able to solve everything immediately, get everything done immediately. And then you get so frustrated whenever it has to be on timetables because there's bureaucracy that has to go through, there's red tape. So give yourself that grace. Know that you're not going to have everything fixed immediately. But if you can do just one small thing to make that step towards it, so whether it be calling up the Voc Rehab office to try to get that meeting scheduled, whether it be trying to, let's say your kid's at home and they're not doing what they're supposed to, giving them some chores and making sure that they're following through on those, giving them some kind of responsibility. Just trying to do those small steps can help add up towards big things. And then when they're ready, have them come to Voc Rehab. They're happy to help. And sometimes it'll be the right time. Sometimes it may not. But if it's not, it's about trying to help them find those services to help them get there. There might be Southwest Autism Project, so SWAP funding that's available. There might be those pre-vocational skills.
We've sat on that board, haven't we?
Yes, we have.
well, I mean, in like the example Michelle gave with just household chores, there's transferable skills that can be developed just simply from household chores. Mm-hmm. So.
Absolutely.
Well, and I like that now you're saying that the cases, there's not like this limited number. I think that takes a lot of pressure off and trying to make it work this time. It's got to work this time. If that's...
Yeah, because we used to hear that a lot.
Right.
We used to hear,
had
you better hurry up because your case can only be open one more time. Like, oh my God, what? Like,
so
there was
we appreciate that.
Yeah, we do too.
Well, and keep in mind, we're talking to Missouri VR because we don't know how other states operate. Right. Other states may be different on that. But here, it's one of those where as long as you still have a disability, as long as you still have a need, we're going to see what we can do.
That's awesome.
In conclusion, is there anything else that you guys would like to add?
I just want to say to the listeners, if you guys haven't sampled the podcast that you guys did on adult autism and supports that guide success, you guys provided a lot of phenomenal resources on that particular podcast.
Oh, thank you.
So if there's listeners out there, that's something that you all provided that's readily available to folks in the community who may be able to benefit from some of those. So I think that might be something for the listeners to check into if you haven't listened to it already.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for being our guest. We're very excited to have you, Michelle and Kyle with Voc Rehab. Thank you so much. We're so glad
really
you came
enjoyed
out.
it. Really enjoyed it. Thank you, ladies.
Good.
And
Thank you.
Love what you guys are doing here.
Oh, thank you.
Thanks.
Great resource for us. Thank you so much. Okay, Tara, where can everyone find us?
Okay, you can find us at navigatingadultautism.com. That's our website. You can listen to us on Apple, Spotify, or our website. We also are on social media, Facebook and Instagram, under Navigating Adult Autism Podcast. And our email is moms@navigatingadultautism.com.
Great. Thanks again.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Bye-bye.
much. Thank you.